What was film going? What was film culture? What was it like to see an alternative experimental movie in the late 40s, early to mid 1950s, when Susan Sontag was a young woman experiencing cinema in New York?
Yeah, well, I should say perhaps in defense of Susan Sontag, that she's really referring to two historical periods. The one that you just mentioned, Cinema 16, beginning around 1947. This is working, right? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. But then she's also talking about the period beginning around 1960, at least as far as New York was concerned, namely the period of the French New Wave, auteurism in the cinema, and a flowering, you might say, of international art cinema that we were very privileged at the New York Film Festival to be able to present. I was the first director of that festival from 1963 to 69, and during that period I have not the slightest doubt that the average level of at least international cinema was very high. I hesitate to say, no, I don't think I'm hesitating to say that it was higher than it is now. And Susan had been very much part of all of this, first as a spectator and then as a critic, so that very soon after the festival, the New York Film Festival started, we asked her to be on our selection committee, and she was on our selection committee with us for quite a few years. I don't know if you want me to go into this now, but the problem she raises is I think an extremely serious one, and I have my own views, which in many respects actually coincide with hers in this respect. But not necessarily in all respects. I mean, I see even today, from time to time, there are films that are really extremely important and forward-looking, both in the international field as well as in the field, in the American independent field. Though again, I would say that the majority of the films I see, as far as the American independents are concerned, are not terribly important to me, or are not important to me at all, because I think all they're trying to do is to imitate Hollywood, so many of them anyway, perhaps using fresher story or new faces, but essentially following the aesthetic dictates. That's funny, aesthetic dictates of Hollywood. But they do that, and that to me is a kind of a kiss of death. Because, when I started Cinema 16 in 1947, I remember that I published a kind of youthful manifesto that we gave to every new member as they arrived. And in it, I spoke very strongly, spoke out against Hollywood and against the commercialism of Hollywood. Well, I look at that now, and the only thing I can say is that I think that situation has gotten much worse, for a number of reasons that we, could spend a lot of time on or a little time on. But anyway, I think it's in that sense a very bleak situation in terms of film art. Film commerce we have galore. Film art, very little, and only by accident, almost, I would say.
Okay, well, I'm going to do a flashback now. I told Amos that I was going to structure it like those profiles we read in the New Yorker, where you kind of go forward and then you do a big backstory. So we're going to do that backstory now. I want to hear a little bit about your formative years. You were a very young cinephile in a rather different milieu than New York City. If you talk a little bit about You're growing up, and particularly you're growing up with film, and then the resettling in New York City, and the formative time for Cinema 16.
Okay. Not too complicated. I was born in Vienna, Austria in 1921, and I remember that even as a very young person, I would say certainly by the age of 11 or 12, I began to be very interested in film and tried to see as many films as possible. The real mystery is why that should have been so, but that, we're going to have another evening for that one.
Or back to Vienna.
However, in any case, the one film that I do remember that is very important to me in my development is Night Mail, a British documentary film, which, however, mingled documentary with poetry. W.H. Auden was involved with it and wrote the commentary. It was a film about the British postal system. This film has always remained in my mind because it gave me an idea. I must have been around 14. It gave me an idea that film can be both documentation and also poetry. And if you want to reduce the format of Cinema 16 to 2 words, those are the 2 words, actually. That's very strange to me to remember, but it's true. In 1938, Hitler decided to occupy Austria, and he didn't like my kind. And I was very lucky to be able to escape at the very last moment and to be here to tell that story. And I came to the United States, no money, no profession to speak of, began to do all kinds of odd little jobs to try to make a living. And I got married to my wife Marcia, who is sitting here, by the way. And
who we should acknowledge was the membership secretary for the formative years of Cinema 16, very active, and also the kind of archivist, I think, of Cinema 16 as well.
Right.
Maurice Vogel.
And then I began to realize that there were quite a few films sitting around in New York that were seen only by school children or union members or church organizations. They were educational films, scientific studies, avant-garde films, and there was no place in which an ordinary person, who just like myself, could see them. Then I got this brilliant insight. Listen, if I'm interested in a city of 7 million people in such films and they cannot be seen, there must be other people who would be interested. So Marcia and I and some friends of ours got together, and I began to very seriously look at films that were around. I went to distributors, they showed me their films on their premises, and I began to select and amass a group of films that I knew about. And then the next step was, okay, we're going to rent a theater and we're going to show one evening of such films. Why not? 2 performances in one evening. We rented the Provincetown Playhouse, a very historic little place, full of peculiar smells and cats and what have you, and no real booths. The projectionists had to climb up on ladders to get to the booth, to the hole in the wall. There was a booth. So anyway, we rented that and put on one program that I had selected, and 2 performances. It was so successful that we immediately had to put it on 16 different evenings, 16 different times, 8 evenings. So we knew that there was something there, and that was really the beginning of Cinema 16. We then repeated that with started a new program. Then we ran into a problem that we can discuss later, something called censorship, and became a membership film society in order to escape the censorship of New York State at the time. And then this thing grew from, initially 200 people to a yearly membership of 7,000 in New York City. We showed in a very large auditorium, 1,600 seats, and we had 2 performances per night, so 3,200 people came to that. And then on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock, we showed films at the Paris Theater, the Maryhill Theater, the Beekman Theater, and they were all these things were sold out. And this lasted for 16 years. I'm not complaining about any of this. And that's the story of Cinema 16. If you want any further details, I'll be glad to supply them.
Okay, was it me or are there a lot of 16s in that history? There's a little bit of This Is Your Life to tonight, because there is another filmmaker who had a similar idea about the Provincetown Playhouse, who had similarly used it as a space to show her work. And I thought we might begin looking at some excerpts by seeing her first film. This is Maya Deren, and this is a film that you came to embrace and also include in Cinema 16 program. So we have an excerpt. This is about the first third of Measures of the Afternoon. I said before, one of the exciting things for me is to hear a little bit about, not to turn it into kind of the People magazine or the avant-garde, but to hear a little bit about the personalities, some of whom were quite extraordinary. And Maya Deren really is a major figure from the period, someone who oftentimes in the histories is portrayed as the kind of one-woman catalyst for the post-war American experimental cinema. Was she, in a way, that larger person within the film scene?
Yes, without a doubt. I would say that this entire flowering of the American avant-garde film movement that occurred beginning in the 1940s was due essentially to three factors. One was a film society on the West Coast that started about the same time that we started, Art and Cinema at the San Francisco Museum of Art. Frank Stauffacher was the head of it, and his career and his life were tragically cut short about 2 years later. But the program he put on was of extreme importance, and in fact it just happened about the same time that we started, and he definitely influenced me and I influenced him. But there was also that one person, Maya Deren, who in retrospect, since she also was a filmmaker, a critic, a teacher, an organizer, in addition to everything else, a stern moralist in her own way, an early beat person, if you want to use that term. We'll come back to that at some point. But in any case, Maya Deren was absolutely crucial to the evolution of this movement. Here is one extremely important reason for it, namely, when she began to make her films together with her husband Alexander Hammett Hackenschmidt, who was also an European import documentary filmmaker, but also very interested in poetic films. When she began to do that, she was the only one who conceived of the idea that these films could be shown publicly, and since nobody else was going to do it, she was going to do it herself. And guess what she did? She rented the Provincetown Playhouse. She did that before Cinema 16. We knew about it. We had been to the showings at the Provincetown Playhouse that she held. And what did she show? She did not show what we showed. We showed only short films, but all kinds, 6 or 7 in one program. And it could have been documentary, experimental, scientific studies, psychological studies, what have you. That's not what she did. She showed her own films only. And that was very significant and very important, and these became important events in New York. I remember, when we went there, everybody talked about the Maya Deren films, and she did that more than once. And she continued to do it, and then she went a step further, of course, a very important step. Why not make these films available to other centers nationally, to other universities and film clubs? And she began to do that too. And then afterwards she also played a very significant role, continued to, because she developed the idea and began to talk to me about it, of a creative film foundation that would support only avant-garde filmmakers. And she decided that if this were to be done, that the award-winning film should then be shown at Cinema 16. And that's what we began to do, and for a period of 5 or 6 years, every year we had these events, and Maya was absolutely fabulous, among other things, about getting really important people, not fly-by-nights or society figures with money. Unfortunately, she never was able to get money from either society figures or non-society figures, but she was interested in the intellectuals and in the critics and in people who mattered. So that when you look at the list of the board of directors of the Creative Film Foundation, it's almost like a joke. I mean, beginning with Joseph Campbell and Maya Shapiro and James Johnson Sweeney, and George Amber, and the guy who was the head of Grove Press at the time, Barney Russett, when he was still doing good things. But that's a different story. And then there were several others that I can't think of at the moment, but I mean, it gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. Clement Greenberg, yes, And these were the people who decided who the best avant-garde films of the year were going to be, and then these best films were shown at Cinema 16. And then she got little people like Salvador Dali or Lotte Lenya to come and present the awards to these filmmakers. The great moment in their lives, needless to say, They hadn't expected that when they made their maybe 5-minute or 10-minute film, So, and they were all great films. I loved them. So anyway, Maya. Yes, so that's the film you have just seen is probably her most famous one. If I'm not mistaken, it's the first one. And interestingly enough, just to show you about history, the film you've just seen is not the film that she showed or that we showed. We showed a silent film. In the beginning, all of her films were silent, and she wouldn't have it any other way. And she said, it's got to be silent. You got to look at the image. The music comes out of the poetry of the image and not from anything else. That was then, because she was still married to Alexander Hammett, who had taught her a great deal about filmmaking. He was an experienced and professional filmmaker at the time when she just began to work. We all interconnect with other people. That's very important to remember. So anyway, with him she made these silent films and defended them vociferously. Then they got divorced. Then there was a second husband, a very wonderful Asian musician, a composer, Teiji Ito. And either he convinced her or she convinced him, I don't remember that part of the story, to add this interesting soundtrack to the film. So this was done with her permission. It's not something, that happens to filmmakers too, that after they die, all kinds of strange things happen to their films. Not in this case. She said, okay, but this is not the film that was shown originally.
Well, let me ask you about something that Maya Deren did after Cinema 16 was up and running for several years. You decided that you wanted to have a symposium about something that was very much a burning issue for her and I think for experimental film at the time, the relationship of poetry and film. Many of these early films are called cine poems. Many of the younger filmmakers came out of a background with poetry. Poetry often became the sort of text for or the analog for some of the stylistic devices or formal devices. So you decided at Cinema 16 to mount a rather impressive panel in the mid-50s that included Deren. You want to talk a little bit about that, about the Poetry and Film Symposium?
Yeah. We didn't know it when we planned it or when we put it on that this would become such an important event in American independent avant-garde film history, but it did. Let's see who was on that panel. Parker Tyler, film critic and author. Willard Maas, who was himself an independent avant-garde filmmaker. Dylan Thomas, Arthur Miller, I don't know. I keep on thinking it was one other person, but I'm not sure. And Meyer, of course. This event was shown at this large theater, the 1,600-seat theater I mentioned before. 2 performances, twice. So when they finished their discussion at the end of the first performance, and they took a little break, and then they came back and continued the discussion, very hot and heavy discussion, for the second audience. Now, that was a wonderful and very important evening for all of us. And everybody there, one way or the other, revealed themselves, for what they were. That's inevitable in that kind of clash of intellects or non-intellects, as the case may be. I remember a horrible part of the story which had to do with the fact that this was really Dylan Thomas's last trip to the United States. And of course I had to go and see him. I'd never met him before. But after he had agreed to appear, I had to go to see him in his hotel, the Hotel Chelsea, famous Hotel Chelsea in New York, and to tell him what the evening was going to be like and what might be expected of him, just like Bruce did with me tonight, So I went to his hotel room, and it was one of the most horrible experiences of my life, because there were about 7 or 8 people there who were all talking to him at the same time with their own projects. I was one of them. And he was lying on a bed in a state of total stupor. He was drinking himself to death, and I said to myself, I've never seen a man, it was unbelievable. It was like deliberately he was doing that, and it was clear that it was due to an inner pain that he could not assuage. And I stayed there. It took about 3 hours, maybe 4, to even get to him and talk to him about this event, And then, of course, I remember distinctly how he got himself totally involved with a telephone, with the cord all over his body, and then fell off the bed. And people had to pick him up and put him back on the bed, About 3 weeks after the Cinema 16 event, approximately, he died, of course, in a hospital of what ailed him. So that was a very sad story. But the evening itself was very significant because the lines were very clearly drawn. Clearly, Arthur Miller and Dylan Thomas essentially did not, I hate to say this, but did not quite know what we were talking about, or what Maya Deren was talking about. She had a wonderful way of putting it. Can I go?
Yes.
Because there's something that, it was very simple, and to me this has always been very, very significant. She said that the commercial cinema works on the basis of a linear, horizontal narrative. It begins at point A and ends at another point Z at the end of the film. And she said the avant-garde, poetic cinema, whatever you want to call it, experimental cinema, is totally different. It's vertical. And it could be the analysis of one moment in time. It's not a simple time story like we have in the Hollywood cinema, but it's an exploration in depth. And she went into that. All the Dylan Thomas, you would think that a poet who obviously works in the same way, can't see how not, you would think that he would understand that and appreciate it. No, he began to make sort of erotic jokes about, some of us like horizontal and some like vertical, and it really doesn't make much difference, This was sort of and he smiled while he said it. He was more or less sober. I wouldn't say he was sober, but he was more or less sober, and he made complete sentences out of what he had to say. And he remains a great poet in my eyes, but didn't work too well. So there was this type of discussion all evening, and if you want to read about it, I think it was reprinted, wasn't it?
Yeah, it appears in Film Culture Reader. I think it's in the original issues of Film Culture as well, and it's well worth reading. There's some very wicked humor that emerges as well.
There are also tapes of that event, audio tapes, not video.
We have a chance to look at maybe one of the classic poetic films of the period. This is Sidney Peterson's Lead Shoes. It's actually based on a Scottish folk tale, Scottish poem or ballad, and it has that clear verticality because the moment of its occurrence, let's say, the moment of its story is sort of situated between all sorts of kind of micro events. It's very much a film about the kind of other reality that the camera can often show. So why don't we take a look at this? Is the again the opening 3 or 4 minutes of Sidney Peterson's The Lead Shoes. I know you were very attracted to this film. This film appears on at least 2 of the Cinema 16 programs, and you particularly paired it, I think, the second time with other films about the subconscious and the sort of dreamlike cinema. What really captured your imagination in seeing this film, and how did you discover this?
Yeah, well, this was not the first Peterson film we showed. The first Peterson film we showed was on the very first program. It was called The Potted Psalm, and it was co-authored by James Broughton, another West Coast filmmaker and poet. And then after that there were other films, The Cage, and Sidney Peterson continued to make films like that for quite some time. You're raising a very important point here, in my opinion, because this whole emphasis on the unconscious and on dreams is a very important aspect of the early American avant-garde film movement. You have it in Maya Deren. I mean, this entire film is like a dream, The Meshes of the Afternoon. In fact, a dream where the dream begins to intervene in actual reality, real reality so-called, and where the protagonist is ultimately destroyed in Maya Deren's film by a dream. So, this was a period in American history where I think perhaps in general the artists were more open to this whole psychoanalytic interpretation, or, this whole question of dreams, the analysis of dreams, and how dreams,
Did your own birthplace of Vienna predispose you to
me? I know
to being sympathetic to people who actively sought this medium as a device to gain access to their unconscious?
I would say no. The problem was, actually, I found out, as an adult, that Freud had lived 3 minutes away from my home, and undoubtedly, since I was often on the street doing stupid things, I must have met this guy because he loved to walk a lot. So, nevertheless, no, I would not say that. But then after I came here, I certainly was also influenced by this. Also, there's a second influence, particularly in Peterson, not in Maya Deren, not at all, namely Surrealism. Peterson, in my opinion, is the only genuine American surrealist filmmaker of note, that we have developed. And this film is a good example. I wish we had the time, perhaps you can do it some other time to show it in full, because there really is a story here. It may not be obvious, and there is a story that's based on dream-like motivations, and again, the unconscious, and reworking of an old Scottish ballad in a new form. Incidentally, Peterson, who continued to make films all his life, is still alive, and recently, just a couple of weeks ago, was honored in New York at the age of 91. He's now 91 years old. He was young then. I don't know, something happened. But in any case, he's 91, and he gave a wonderful speech, very much in total command of language and thought. It's interesting to see, So, and he had an important influence in the American avant-garde movement as a representative of that tendency. There are a great many different tendencies, and he is the surrealist among them.
I wonder if we could reverse the lens a second, or do a counter shot. What was the audience response to seeing, say, the work of Peterson, to seeing work that again, probe different states of consciousness and, again, the dreamlike or delusional experience.
That's a very important and not easy question to answer. First of all, how do you gauge an audience response? We're talking about several thousand people, and so we didn't do market research type of questionnaires where we asked them this or that. We didn't do that. So what could we go by? What did they do at the end of the film? Did they boo or applaud or both, or were they totally silent? Or did they walk out and say, I'll never be a member of this organization again, which many people did. My wife, Marcia, who was the membership secretary, she had the trouble outside of the auditorium. I was inside watching that everything should be in focus, maybe even hiding from the wrath of the membership. Speaking of the subconscious, Marcia was outside, full glaring light, and they were coming out sometimes during the film saying, I don't want to ever see this kind of thing again, and how dare you show that. There were also problems with sex, and things like that, and the unconscious, for some people was something very uncomfortable to deal with. So it was a very complex situation. Now, secondly, we had a seriously split audience because of my philosophy, which was to embrace both the documentary and the experimental. The documentary included, we showed at Symposium a lot of scientific studies, psychological studies, nature studies, social documentaries, political documentaries of all types. I was very interested in those as well, and that was the time in America when such films were made and very successfully made. So that was one thing. At the same time, I loved the avant-garde cinema. To this day, nobody has explained to me how this could come about, but that's the way I was. And as a result, half the program would be, let's say, documentary or factual or what have you. The other half would be avant-garde cinema. There was a split in the audience, without a doubt. Some people were only documentarians. Some people, if you want to use that term, some people were only avant-gardists. Then there was a smaller group of in-betweeners like me that could accept both. So therefore, if we showed, I remember with Peterson, for example, there was applause, and then there was also nothing, and then some people, as they left or later on, complained about the showing of that film. So I always followed something that a man, I once read a quote by Stokowski, who is of absolutely no interest to me. But nevertheless, in that quote, he said, oh, they don't like Brahms in Detroit, I'll play him again. That was his philosophy. That's good, that was my philosophy too. They didn't like Peterson, too bad for them. I felt, I was young and, I had certain strong beliefs, and I felt these films should be shown, and I showed them. And that's all I can say. So the question of the audience cannot be easily resolved. I can also say something else. I don't know if this is the point to say it, but you might be amused to hear that. We were the first ones at that time who showed actual birth films to a general audience. You could not see them otherwise. And what was very funny is we found out very early on that if we did that, we better bring some smelling salts with us to the theater, and also stand ready to sort of, how should we say it nicely, clean up. Because some people were overcome by the sight of birth and left a little present wherever they were. This is history, what can I do? And to clinch the story, these people were always males. Never did any female have any problems with seeing this, whether or not they had had children.
Well, you've set us up for our next excerpt. I hope we will be giftless following.
It's only an excerpt.
It's only an excerpt, right? This is the opening section of Stan Brakhage's birth film to characterize experimental birth film, Window Water Baby Moving. And we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about Brakhage, who was really like the young kid on the block in terms of experimental filmmakers of this period. But why don't we take a look at this section, Window Water Baby Moving, Stan Brakhage. Would you have included this film in terms of your characterization of birth films? The films you were talking about before were more scientific or medical films that showed.
Correct. I would not have included it. It's a film that deals in a very direct and very powerful fashion, I think, ultimately, with birth. That's the subject of the film. But I wouldn't have included it. I was talking more about, as you correctly pointed out, the other kind of films. But this film is quite important, actually, in terms of Brakhage's evolution. You know, Brakhage ultimately became really one of the very large names of the American avant-garde film movement. But at that time, he was still at the beginning. He was a very young man when he first appeared in our office. We were all very young, but he was a very young man, and he still made films that dealt quite clearly with reality, although in a very peculiar and wonderful poetic way, you know. He made a film, Flesh of Morning, which dealt with masturbation. He made a film called Desist Film, very realistic about issues or problems of young people, poetic, however. He made a couple other films like that, and only later did he go in the direction that made him ultimately really famous, which is abstraction, or abstract expressionism, if you want to call it that. So this is really a film that still belongs to the very first period of his life, and I think it's quite amazing. You know, there's a sort of a brutal physicality about it, and yet it's suffused with love, you know, for his wife. He had, in fact, I think at least 4 children with her, if not 6, I'm not sure, because then there was a second wife and there were at least 4 to 6 children there, so I can't keep track of it. I hope he can. But it is suffused with that wonderful feeling he had for her, and vice versa. And yet at the same time, this cannot be looked at as a realistic portrayal of young lovers or giving birth, you know. It's in the direction of poetry.
It was seen, I think, at the time. I mean, it looks almost slow now, and obviously our eyes are 90s MTV eyes or whatever. But in fact, the film becomes more kinetic as we get into the actual birth. But this was a fairly. I mean, this was as disjunctive as Godard's jump cuts were for a narrative film-going audience. Would you say?
Yes, definitely. And preceded Godard.
He was a figure who ultimately, in a way, left the fold of Cinema 16. You embraced this early work, and his later work went into different venues. Did you ever? It's maybe an odd way of saying it, but did you ever regret that the connection with Brakhage stopped after a certain point, given that he became really internationally known?
Yeah. It didn't really stop. For example, he called us just a couple of weeks ago out of the blue with a very warm and lengthy phone call about, you know, the field and what has happened and so on and so forth. He spoke to both of us, and he primarily to Marcia, in fact. I can't say. I would have to say that I did not completely aesthetically go along with what some of the things he did subsequently, and I'm in a minority in that. There's no doubt that the majority feels that, you know, indeed this was the right thing to do, whatever he did. But we did not separate. I mean, there was many separations in my life, sure, but Brakhage is really not one of them.
Okay. I'm going to steer us back onto what we're talking about tonight, which is the connection with beat culture. Brakhage is a rather singular figure in this period, not only because he became a prolific filmmaker, but he also made a choice that was very different from almost anyone of his generation. He decided that he did not want to live in the big city. He didn't want to live in San Francisco or New York or even Denver. And he picked up with his very young wife and his soon-to-be large family and settled in a ghost town, or an ex-mining town in Colorado. And in that way really opted out of most of the social connections that would have been part of, let's call it, the kind of beat milieu.
Absolutely.
And yet, the Whitney, in organizing their film sidebar, kind of embrace him. And I'm curious, do you see him as kind of part and parcel of that moment? I mean, he's almost, when you see the slightly later, he's almost like proto-hippie more than proto-beat. I mean, he's got long hair and the beard, and he's growing his own food, and he's actually into, to use that term, a different trip than the kind of urban-based beat culture.
Yes, I see him definitely as part of that. Yes, of course. And I'm not even quite sure, but I won't go into that now, I think, as to the fundamental distinction between hippie and beat. But that's a different story. They were all rebels against, I guess you'd have to say, bourgeois society. And yes, he was very much part of that and remained that, and the way he lived and the way he continued to live, as you said, the ghost town. I think, as a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, this film was shot. He was already living in a ghost town when he made it, all by himself in that town and his family. But, as he got older, for example, for many, many years now, he has been a full-time professor, a teacher, at the Chicago, I don't know exactly where he is.
He was for years in Chicago, and then he had another post in Toronto, and I think he's back now in Colorado.
Yeah, right.
University of Colorado.
University of Colorado.
Right. So, yeah, but he's very definitely part of that movement. He considered himself part of it, and the others considered him part of it. There was no distinction, no break.
One more update on Brakhage. Brakhage has spent, I think, the last 5 or 6 years working without a camera, creating most of his films by hand painting on IMAX size film stock and making his films, I think, releasing them in 35 and 16 millimeters. So the abstract expressionist impulse went all the way to its logical extent.
And there was an early film of his that was completely done, without the use of a camera, Morse light, I think 3 or 4 minutes. And, he had different parts of a Morse, or maybe more than one Morse. I never checked into that. On the frame, and then as you run it off, it becomes a gorgeous symphony of colors, abstract colors. Very successful film in my opinion, without any camera, without the use of a camera. Yeah.
We're going to move into the abstract form now, and this is actually one of the later films by John Whitney, and the Whitneys were West Coast based, and I think we can talk after we see this. This is the opening section of Lapis, but I think these were enormously popular and influential films.
Yes.
Even though abstract, I think they had a clear crossover audience with all sorts of film goers. Let me take a look at the opening of Lapis. Now, this is later than the films of the Whitneys that you were showing, but I'm curious. One would think that these were both influential and popularly successful. And were they? Can you talk a little bit about the reception for this body?
Yeah, well, as you said, this is a later film of one of the two brothers. They always used to work, and initially they worked together on all the films, and then they began to make films separately as well. The one we showed at Cinema 16 was called 5 Abstract Film Exercises. It was their earlier work, and it was done by both of them together. They were more acceptable to, let's call it the non-avant-garde audience than, say, Brakhage. It was easier to accept that, and but that in no way makes their work any less important. I think they're extremely important and beautiful. I mean, it's wonderful to watch these things. What happened with them is initially this was their interest in abstraction. It was really an aesthetic interest in, the evolution of forms and the analysis of shapes, forms, non-literal images. But later on, particularly James developed in the direction of, I would almost say, well, certainly a mystical element in his films, religious, if not religious. And of course, by that I refer to Eastern religions and Buddhism, which again is one of the great preoccupations of that rebellious movement in America of the period, and then of the 60s later. This comes through even in the choice of music for this film, and also I think you might say in the images. But in any case, that was one of his preoccupations. So you have this kind of meditative aspect to this, meditation, which we know is part of the Buddhist philosophy, or can be, and it's expressed here by the filmmakers in this film. So the acceptance was, as I said, rather larger than for some of the other avant-gardists.
I'm curious that a film like this, there's a kind of odd tension, and maybe it's kind of reading it with a slightly revisionist eye, but it's a film that could only be realized because of fairly advanced and sophisticated technologies.
Yes.
There's a kind of let's say a slight mismatch between its Eastern roots and its highly Western technology. Was that ever seen as a kind of
no, actually, as an acceptance of both. I'm very glad you brought that up, because I know that they have written about it and talked about it, the Whitney brothers, meaning an acceptance of both Eastern philosophy and mysticism, as well as metaphysical aspects, as well as Western science. There was not a rejection, of either, but rather an attempt to fuse them. So by these very advanced methods that they used to make these films, at the same time what they expressed was the other, that mystical element.
Did you find that, say, after a program that might have included some of their films, particularly because they were West Coast and you were bringing them to the East Coast, did it have an impact in the next couple of years? Did you start to see East Coast makers try their hand at this type of abstract filmmaking?
Without a doubt, yes. Although sometimes it's hard to tell whether, one would have to really go back and look at the dates of some of these productions. It would be hard to tell whether it was due to an influence like this, because of course among the audiences were all kinds of either budding filmmakers or already filmmakers, or people who had never made a film before, but they were going to make a film in the next few years, So that's hard to say, but anyway, that was definitely the case. I think there's no doubt about it. There was a whole movement of, whenever you talk about the American avant-garde, as far as I'm concerned, you can always see a great many different tendencies within it. Certainly Maya Deren is completely different from the Whitney brothers and what they did. And then there were quite a few who worked not in the Whitney tradition, but who worked with abstractions only. Quite a few, not just one or two. Good ones too.
Can I ask, this is really to go back, in your boyhood viewing, you were actually a member of a film society in Vienna.
Yes.
And you mentioned seeing Night Mail. Would you have seen any of the Oscar Fissinger animated films of that period?
If I did, I certainly don't remember it. I doubt it. I think that film society was primarily, was not devoted to the avant-garde. I don't even recall seeing what I might have seen, or what I did see after I came here, namely the French avant-garde of the 1920s, which is a very important first avant-garde film movement. I don't recall seeing that in Vienna at the time. No, did not.
And then to go back to Cinema 16, did you have painters? You were talking about who were members of Cinema 16, a rather remarkable range of people. Were visual artists also part of that body? We know the
remarkable range of people.
Yes.
That would be a good definition. I mean, it was quite amazing. It went all the way from, say, school teachers, or people who wanted to widen their horizons, to filmmakers and artists and intellectuals and writers and people like Cheryl Crawford. I think I mentioned her to you, a well-known Broadway producer, and Harold Clurman. I mean, I don't know, I can't think of names at the moment, but it was a very great mix of people. And so it definitely included people who were not interested in this kind of stuff at all. I mean, everything we've seen here tonight was of no interest to probably, I don't know, 1/4 of our membership, or something like that. And then, either they had to sign up for a year. So either they signed up, it was very expensive, $10 for 16 performances and 2 free guest tickets. So anyway, either they signed up or they didn't. And whatever they wanted to do, they did. It was okay with me, but I was going to continue showing this kind of stuff.
We're going to take a look at a film, and actually it has a relationship to film societies. This is actually the first film by an artist working in the Bay Area, Bruce Conner. And it turns out Bruce Conner started his own film society slightly before, or he co-founded a tiny film society, and not a very successful one, called Camera Obscura in the Bay Area, because he felt that the one that he could go to, Pauline Kael's Cinema Guild, wasn't showing enough experimental work. And then he was finally feeling that he wasn't seeing the right kind of experimental work, and that he wanted to see a certain kind of film, and when he didn't see it, he decided he would make that kind of film, and the result was a movie, which he went around and showed in hopes of having a film society show it, and apparently Pauline Kael rejected it, and he contacted you and said, would you like to see a movie? And you apparently were a little more forthcoming. Now we take a look at, this is the opening, probably about the opening quarter of Bruce Conner's movie. So what did you think when you saw this film sent to you by a young artist from the West Coast who had never made a film before?
We got this letter out of the blue. I still have it. I cherish it. Say, dear Mr. Vogel, I got this little film. Would you like to see it? I think you might be interested in it. And I saw it. I was very interested in it. And this film is, of course, one of the classics of the American avant-garde. I always feel bad when we only show part of a film. It's like part of the baby coming out, not the other part. So anyway, I think it's a marvelous film, and it's so amazing because it consists entirely of stock footage. The entire footage. There isn't a single shot in this film, even the 5 minutes or so that you didn't see, that was shot by Bruce Conner. He just picked up stock footage everywhere, including what used to be called in those days girly films, and newsreel shots, and there's Mickey Mouse in there later on, what have you. And when you look at it, first you think, well, that's some kind of a compilation of, it's not very, it's interesting, but you don't know at the very beginning where this is going. It's very funny, too. And then you realize that there is a great deal of thought behind this film. Actually, it's a very pessimistic statement about the human condition. But done in such a wonderful way that you're enjoying it while you're being made fun of, you might say. So he represented still another aspect of the avant-garde, collage. And by the way, here I just saw today this. He is a well-known collage artist. He's represented at the Museum of Modern Art in their collection, etc. And you have one here. Is it called The Bride or the Bride, right? That's a wonderful example of his work right in this exhibition outside. So he was here recently, right?
Yes,
last week or so?
Yes, we showed this in about 7 other films.
Oh,
There's
really?
actually one of his films playing continuously in the galleries, a documentary, but a very different kind of documentary of Jay DeFeo's Rose, called The White Rose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the story. You have to understand that what we're talking about here is really a major movement in American arts, in at least cinematic arts, namely, a flowering of a new kind of avant-garde, beginning in the 1940s and continuing well into the 70s, etc. I mean, there's a great deal to be said, which we can't go into now, but this movement is indeed represented by all the people you're seeing here today in this very careful, wonderful selection you have made here, because these are the leading elements. There are many others, but so you're not talking about some individuals, making a film here or there, and Cinema 16 got them together and showed them. No, we were lucky, or maybe we had to arise at a certain moment in history because there was such a movement afoot. It was beginning. And then our showings, of course, fostered that. And Maya Deren's Creative Film Foundation and her work fostered that. And then there were more films and more filmmakers. So it became really a very important and proud movement among film people.
I wonder if we could focus on maybe one of the luckiest, if we'll call it that, the luckiest combinations or confluence of film. You not only premiered John Cassavetes' first feature film, Shadows, but you premiered it on a program that also had Robert Frank and Alfred Leslie, Pull My Daisy, which many people view as the first and maybe only true beat film. Clearly a major film that introduced this whole culture with Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso and Peter Orlovsky and the painter Larry Rivers and many other people coming into in the film and into that production. Let's take a little segment of Pull My Daisy, and I'd like to go back after we see it and hear a little bit about what that night was like, where these two major films were given their world premieres. We're going to see this on video, but the video was provided by the co-director of Pull My Daisy, Alfred Leslie. This is Alfred Leslie's video of Pull My Daisy. It's showing continuously at the entrance of the gallery, so I urge you to come. It's about 29 minutes long. It goes on and even gets better.
This show continuously?
This shows continuously. And actually, a better copy even, the Robert Frank rather than the Alfred Leslie version put onto Laserdisc, so it's even slightly better quality. And it has the original title, which was to be Beat Generation, on the copy shown, so you get it even more special. Talk a little bit about that evening and what the response was to these two very different kinds of films. Shadows being a feature-length film about a black family who, two of whose members pass for white, and a kind of sort of romantic disaffection of a white boyfriend, but a very kind of an urban and somewhat gritty, almost American neorealist film. And this playful and funky Lower East Side mock portrayal of the lives of beats. What was the response to these films?
It was very good. We decided to put these two films together because the common element we found in them was improvisation. And that was certainly true of Cassavetes as well, though in a very different way. And certainly true of this film, which was really almost completely improvised, as we know. And as a matter of fact, Kerouac, who during the shooting of the film was so drunk that he had to be ejected by the others and couldn't stay with them, nevertheless subsequently provided an extremely important part of the film, namely the narration, which is completely improvised, on the spot, from beginning to end. There's no written script or anything like that. And Kerouac's voice can be heard, of course, and people you see in the film are the usual suspects, like Ginsberg and Corso, and David Amram is in it too.
And it's his music that we hear at the very
Right.
beginning.
Right.
Maybe I'll ask it more pointedly. One of the major critics at the time was Parker Tyler. He was part of the symposium that you mounted with Maya Deren and Dylan Thomas and Arthur Miller back in the mid-'50s. After your screening, he wrote a rather impassioned essay called Foreshadows Against Pull My Daisy.
Right, you're right.
Which side did you come out on, or did you come out on either side? Did you feel...
I didn't. No, I mean, I came out on the side of feeling that both were extremely relevant and should be shown, and that they were completely different. They were completely different. I mean, you could never take Cassavetes for one of those guys.